I am the Schleg Daddy, one half of the Wedge Busters! And I move on in my 2011 NFL season preview by taking a look at the NFC South. "2010 was a terrible season for the Carolina Panthers. They finished with a putrid record of 2-14, which not only was good enough, or bad enough in this case, for last place in the NFC South, but they ended up with the worst record in all of the NFL. So not surprisingly, the Panthers organization finally kicked John Fox's ass to the curb. Maybe a year or two too late, if you ask me. In his place, they bring in Ron Rivera. That's right, former Bears defensive coordinator and linebackers coach for the Chargers. Also, probably the other noteworthy change in the Panthers organization is the selection of Auburn quarterback Cam Newton with the #1 overall pick. When you go 2-14, there's pretty much questions everywhere. For the Panthers, their biggest questions are, is Cam Newton ready to be a starting NFL quarterback? Is Steve Smith going to show the form that he displayed in years past of being one of the top wide receivers in the league? Is Ron Rivera going to have a positive impact on the defensive unit for the Panthers that does have some nice pieces there, but really doesn't seem to fulfill its full potential? Who's the player to watch for the Carolina Panthers in 2011? It's an easy answer. There is only one right answer. When you take a quarterback, #1 overall, following a season in which you went 2-14, the quarterback is what fans and players and the organization as a whole look to as a beacon of hope for the future. Therefore, the only thing that really matters for the Carolina Panthers in 2011 is the progress and development of #1 overall selection quarterback Cam Newton. Consequently, 2011 for the Carolina Panthers is not necessarily about wins and losses. It's about progress and development, most notably with #1 overall selection Cam Newton. Now, there are signs that maybe the Panthers could have at least a little bit of a better year than they did in 2010, and I expect them to do so. They still have D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart, and hell, you can even throw a Mike Goodson in there. They have a very good team of running backs, and they have some talent at tight end with Olsen and Jeremy Shockey, and they still have Steve Smith, even though he's a declining player. Cam Newton does have some weapons to work with on the offensive side of the ball, so he won't necessarily have to do it all by himself. Me personally, I was a very big fan of Cam Newton. There's either two ways you think about Cam. You think he's either going to be a great NFL quarterback or a complete bust. And I'm going to say he has that type of athletic ability and size combination that comes along once in a blue moon, and I think he was a little underrated as a passer because, quite honestly, you didn't get to see much of it at all. And I think some of that talent shows through this year. I really do. But I don't expect the Panthers to finish any better than 4-12, and they will bring up the rear in the NFC South. Make no mistake about it. The New Orleans Saints in 2010 had a pretty good season overall, even though it may have ended in disappointing fashion for them in the wild card round of the playoffs. They finished 11-5, good for second in the NFC South. They did make the playoffs and ended up losing to Seattle in the wild card round the year after being Super Bowl champs. So at least they went from Super Bowl champs to making a return appearance in the playoffs. On defense, they were 4th in yards allowed and 7th in points allowed. So they made some strides on the defensive side of the ball. But ultimately, the Saints are an offensive team. They were 6th overall in offensive yardage, but they did finish a kind of putrid 28th in rushing yardage. So not surprisingly, with the Saints' struggles in the running game, the biggest change they made in the offseason was the release of Reggie Bush and the drafting of Alabama running back Mark Ingram in the first round, with the hopes that finally Sean Payton has somebody for Drew Brees to be able to turn around and hand the ball off to consistently 20 to 25 times a ball game. 2 seasons removed from a Super Bowl championship, the New Orleans Saints do have some questions heading into the 2011 season. Drew Brees in 2010 threw 22 picks, and that's a lot. I realize he threw for 4,600 yards and 33 touchdowns, but 22 picks, that's a lot of turnovers. Can Drew Brees do some of the same things he does in the passing game while being able to cut back on some of those mistakes, including some of the bad ones that he made last year? Will Mark Ingram be able to provide the Saints a more consistent between the tackles presence in the running game? How will Marcus Colston recover from his offseason microfracture knee surgery? Will the secondary be able to improve enough to take this Saints defense from being one that's respected and pretty good to being perhaps a very scary defense? The Saints are a really good football team, and part of the problem for them is just the fact that they're in the NFC South with two other really good football teams in the Falcons and the Buccaneers. When you look at the Saints on offense, it's going to come down to, can Mark Ingram provide a consistent between the tackles runner that organization has missed during the Sean Payton era? And as far as Sean Payton and Drew Brees go, can Sean Payton scale back on his pass-happy tendencies in his play calling at times and rely upon that running game a little bit more? And can Drew Brees cut out some of the mistakes, especially some of the bad ones he made in 2010? That's going to be the story on the offensive side of the ball. The biggest defensive problem, again, is just their secondary. They were a pretty good defense in 2010, but at times they could get lit up by people. And you saw their performance in the playoffs against the Seattle Seahawks, and you realize, wow, they still had some holes. Overall, I expect the Saints to be a competitive team all year, to bang with the Bucs and the Falcons for the NFC South Division title, but I do think they'll end up finishing somewhere around 10-6 and being third place, believe it or not, in the NFC South. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2010 were a surprise team, no question about it. Behind head coach Raheem Morris and second-year quarterback Josh Freeman, they ended up finishing 10-6 and in third in the NFC South, just barely missing out on a playoff appearance. Their offense was kind of middle of the road in passing yardage and points scored and total yards. Defensively, they were 28th versus the run and tied for 30th in sacks. So even though there were plenty of things to like about the Buccaneers in 2010, they definitely had areas to address heading into this 2011 season. The Buccaneers went into the offseason feeling that they had some real deficiencies on the defensive side of the ball, in particular on the front seven, and utilized the draft to attempt to address that. In their first 3 picks, they took defensive end Adrian Claiborne from Iowa. They took Daquan Bowers, the defensive end from Clemson, and then linebacker Mason Foster, with the hope being that they would be able to hold up a little better against the run in the case of Foster, and with Bowers and Claiborne in particular, be able to generate that edge rush that is so vital in that Tampa cover 2 scheme, and what has really been missing on the Raheem Morris defenses of the past couple seasons. So some of the questions facing the Bucs in 2011 include, can Josh Freeman in his 3rd season establish himself as a real franchise quarterback for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers? Is LeGarrette Blount going to be able to prove that he was the real deal, and that 2010, his 1,000-yard campaign, was not just a fluke? On defense, will all these high picks, the McCoys, the Brian Prices, the Bowers, the Claibornes, the Mason Fosters, will they start to get some payoff from some of these guys to help take that Buccaneers defense from being just an okay or middle-of-the-road unit to being one of the better defenses in the league? Players to watch for the Buccaneers, to me, there's one on offense and there's one on defense. On offense, it's second-year wide receiver Aurelius Ben. His 2010 campaign, he struggled with injuries. His last few games, he showed himself somewhat well. Now, all the focus and attention is going to be on guys like Mike Williams and Kellen Winslow in that offense. But I do think there is a real chance, and the talent is definitely there, for Aurelius Ben to be the top pass-catching weapon for Josh Freeman in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2011. On defense, to me, another 2010 draft pick. This time, number 3 overall selection, Gerald McCoy. When a team takes you one pick after Ndamukong Suh, and you play that same position, 3 sacks just ain't going to cut it. Gerald McCoy has to, in that Tampa 2 system, be able to generate pressure up the middle. If he is, then you're going to see a vastly, vastly improved Buccaneers pass rush in 2011. And if you don't, the Buccaneers will not win the division, period. Bottom line, there is an awful lot to like about this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team in 2011. They caught some people by surprise in 2010, and some teams may be able to make some adjustments to them. But I still think they have a lot of the pieces in place. I think they'll end up finishing about 11-5. Yeah, 11-5, but still only be good enough to finish second in the NFC South, meaning that the winners of the NFC South will be Atlanta. Was a football hotbed in 2010 as the Falcons finished 13-3 and in first place in the NFC South. Unfortunately for them, they kind of ran into a buzzsaw in the divisional round of the playoffs when Green Bay came in and whooped that ass 48-21. On offense, the Atlanta Falcons finished 5th in the league in points scored. They were the least penalized team, period, in the entire NFL, and they were 2nd in time of possession. On the defensive side of the ball, they made some improvements again. They were 5th in points allowed, but they still struggled in the pass defense in 2 areas, 22nd versus the pass in yardage, and in a tie for 20th in sacks. So they still struggled at times to generate consistent pressure on opposing teams' quarterback. The most notable change or move that the Falcons made in the offseason unquestionably came on draft day. They traded a lot to get up to Cleveland's 6th overall pick and take wide receiver Julio Jones from Alabama, even though there may have been more pressing team needs on defense. The thinking being from the Falcons management that Julio Jones was just too good of a player and would have too much of an impact for them on the offensive side of the ball for them to be able to pass up the opportunity to get him. For a team that's this good, they still have some questions to answer this season. Is this the year that Matt Ryan takes that next step, just like Aaron Rodgers did in 2010, and establishes himself as a clear-cut, elite quarterback in the National Football League? Will Michael Turner be able to have a dominant year? 2009 was kind of an injury-troubled year. He had a good year in 2010, but will he go back to the year that he had in 2008 is the question. Will Julio Jones be able to provide that necessary complement to Roddy White to really open up that Falcons passing attack? On defense, will the Falcons be able to pressure the opposing quarterback better? It's something that they've struggled with in recent seasons. And will their secondary, as you saw, struggle mightily against Green Bay in the divisional playoff, will their secondary be able to hold up against teams with high-powered passing attacks? Your player to watch for the Falcons this year is on defense. It's defensive end Ray Edwards. He was brought in the offseason to provide a better complement to John Abraham. If Ray Edwards is able to come in and get somewhere around 8 to 9 sacks and just be a better threat at left defensive end than they've had in recent years, that will improve the team's ability to rush the passer just that much more. And that also helps out the secondary too, because that way they don't have to defend other teams' receivers nearly as long as they've had to in the past. Bottom line is, I think the Falcons will repeat what they did in 2010 in the regular season. I think they'll go 13-3 and end up walking away with the NFC South title. I want you to let me know down below what you think of the NFC South and the NFL in general in 2011. And don't forget to click that little subscribe button up there. Next up, I'll be previewing the NFC West. I am the Schleg Daddy from the Wedge Busters.